Hey guys, Matt Allen here. Welcome back to Tactical Bassin. Today we are talking swim baits. We're talking giant swim baits. We're talking little paddletail, underspins, finesse swim baiting, all of the above. We're gonna talk glide baits. We are gonna run the gamut. Fall is fast approaching. The bait fish group up. We've been doing fall videos here this past week. You guys know it's coming. Despite it being 110 degrees here a couple days ago. Today's 85 and breezy. Hopefully there's not too much wind for you guys in the camera. 75 degrees tomorrow. Swim bait season is right around the corner. Now what I think of a swim bait and what the next guy thinks of as a swim bait may be different. That's why we're going to talk about all of them, because they all have a place. So we're going to break this up. We're going to talk about the giant baits. Specifically, we're going to talk about that like Vortex style tail. We're going to talk about paddletails. Talk about hard baits, be that a glide bait or a multi-joint bait. But we're going to start talking about what I'd like to call finesse swim baiting, or the little paddletails. You know, Kitex, bass tricks, that sort of thing. We'll start there. We'll work our way back across. The reason we're going to start there is because the smaller swim baits are the largest category. That's what the bulk of you guys are going to use. And then depending on what kind of fish or bait fish rather, are in your lakes, you'll be increasing size or going to different styles to best match the hatch, if you will. So the little baits, with fall coming in every lake across the country, if there are bait fish, those bait fish will begin to school up. And when they school up, the bass will begin to feed heavily on them. That's where the little baits start to shine. Now the size of the bait is dependent on the size and the kind of bait fish that you have in your lake. So if you have little pin minnows or silverside minnows or pond smelt or shad, something like that, you're going to adjust the size to best match what's going on there in the lake. And then we also have the option to throw a plain head versus an underspin. So where do we go? Where do we start? What should you be throwing? Well, let's start off talking about the plain head versus the underspin, especially as it relates to the smaller baits. Typically the plain heads, whether that's with the little guy, that's like a little dart head, like this one, or a revenge dart head. And like every video, guys, because there's going to be a ton of recommendations here, and what I'm about to show you are baits that I have faith in. So when you get into the swim bait game, you know, you can spend just a couple bucks, or you can start spending big money. And when you're doing that, it's a little bit scary because there is a lot of money involved. There's specialized gear, the specialized equipment. You want to know that you're making the right purchases. So the baits that I'm talking about are baits that Tim and I have personal confidence in. These are baits that we can tell you, if you buy them and you go to your lake, whether you're getting bit or not, you're not wasting your time. You know, if you show up on a lake in the Midwest and you don't know if you're throwing a bait that works or not, that's very difficult. The baits that we're going to talk about are baits that we're telling you they work. So you can take those baits and see how well they work on your lake. But it's not the bait. The bait does work. So we'll give you all these recommendations, really shorten your learning curve, cut it down to baits that work very consistently across the whole country. And then you can choose the ones that are best for you. So going back, whether you're throwing a little dart head or a big 3/4 ounce head like this, that's the Matt Allen Swimbait head, that's my head. But throwing a big one like this, that's just dependent on the size of the bait and how deep the bait is schooling. But when we go with a plain head versus an underspin, whether that's a little underspin like the little cool baits, or a big one like the Blade Runner, or where I take one of my heads and I put in that screw lock in the belly like we talked about last week, that has to do with how tight the bait fish are schooled. If they're in massive schools, you absolutely want that flash. If they're in massive schools around cover, you want to be weedless with that hidden hook. If they're in massive schools in the open water, then you want an exposed hook because you're going to have a better hookup ratio. It's easier to hook those fish with that exposed hook. If you get bit on a weedless, you have to know that you got bit and set the hook in order to expose it. This style hook, where it's exposed, especially with a small one like this little guy, as long as you're reeling when they eat it, that hook will just catch on its own. You'll realize you have a fish on and then set the hook if you're not paying attention. So it really shortens the learning curve, makes it easier to hook those fish. But again, if they're around cover, whether they're in weeds or lay down brush, whatever it might be, if they get into cover, you want to go weedless. But again, underspin versus no underspin is as simple as determining how thick the bait is. If you don't need to stand out from the crowd, if you're one of only a handful of minnows going down the shoreline, then you go plain. Because that plain head is the most natural in appearance. It'll fool them the best, if you will. But the underspin, that adds flash. So if there are thousands and thousands and thousands of minnows and you need to stand out from the crowd, they're already eating minnows. You just need to be the minnow that they choose to eat. That extra flash is all the difference between getting bit and not getting bit. It has nothing to do with realism. It has to do with getting their attention and taking it away from the thousands of other minnows. Pretty simple. Now size-wise, that again, you're just matching bait. You want to be the same size as the bait that they're targeting or slightly larger. If they're eating 2-inch minnows, I'm not throwing an 8 or a 10-inch Huddleston. If they're eating 2-inch minnows, I'm throwing a 2.8 or a 3.8 or a little 4-inch. Still very small, that right size category to where it's natural. It looks right in the water. Again, in that video description, we'll give you some basic color recommendations, weight recommendations for head, that sort of thing. All the different heads that we throw, and then you can try and sort out which ones best apply to you. But that's basically the Paddletails. And again, the two that we use, just flat out, we use the Kitech and we use the Bastrix. We use Kitech 90+% of the time. The suckers just work. They flat get bit. The Bastrix was such a killer a few years ago. It sort of went away there for a little bit because everybody was throwing it. But now that so many guys are turning to a Kitech, that bite's coming back too. So you don't want to forget about the Bastrix. We'll always have love for that bait. But for the most part these days, we're throwing a Kitech and it just smashes them. Stepping up in size, getting into what we'll call the real swim baits. They're basically 3 different styles. You got your hard baits, and then we've got soft baits, and we'll divide soft baits into 2 categories. We'll go with that Vortex style tail, and we'll go with that paddle tail. Because they do very different things, and they have very different purposes. But before we get there, we'll talk hard baits. Hard baits, I suppose you can also break into 2 categories. We're going to talk glide, which is a single joint sinking bait. And in this video, this fall video, I'm actually not going to talk about surface baits at all. No wake baits at all. It's not because they won't eat topwater. They will smash topwater, but it's sort of its own category. When I think fall swim baits, I think subsurface. Whether I'm thinking little Kitechs or glide baits or big baits, I'm thinking subsurface. So that's where we're gonna focus. So for hard baits, glide bait versus multi-joint just has to do with how aggressive your fish are. If you're at the lake and they are smashing the bait, just killing it up shallow, you go with that multi-joint bait, like a bull shad, or there's some others, but this is one that I have confidence in. The reason why is that I can burn this bait very, very hard, very, very fast. Aggressive stop, burn, stop, burn, stop. It's almost like crankbaiting. Very, very aggressive. And you can get them to just lash out and massacre that bait. But if they're not that aggressive, if you get on the water and you're not seeing them actively feeding, then I'll go to the glide. Be that a Gancraft or an S-Waver. Typically in the fall, I'm throwing the smaller sizes. 168 in that S waiver is my preferred size for the fall. Reason for that, again, this is going to vary lake to lake. If you're on a lake that's primarily trout and kokanee, you can take that information, throw it out the window. You want to match whatever size trout and kokanee are in your lake. But if we're talking bait fish, regardless of what bait fish that is, if we're talking bait fish, the bait fish are only about halfway to maturity in the fall most of the time. So you don't need to throw those giant baits. That in between, that 5 to 7 inch size glide bait is going to be an absolute killer. For Tim and I, that 168 waiver is the one in the fall. And then no matter where you are in the country, you want to match the hatch. Again, you want to kind of match color for the most part, with the exception of this silly color, the light trout. I'm telling you, it doesn't matter where I go in the country. It doesn't matter if I'm on the Great Lakes, if I'm on a lake that's never had trout in it, if it's crystal clear, if it's chocolate milk, if I'm in the north, if I'm in the south, if I'm out here, they smash that light trout. I think it has to do with visibility. It's just a very easy to see color, and it has some detail. It has some spots, it has some stripes. It's just broken up. It doesn't particularly look like anything. It really doesn't look like a trout to me at all. It's got some yellow on it. It's kind of a goofy color, but everywhere I go, they eat it. So if I was only going to buy one, that would be the one. But they've got a lot of great colors. You can look at them. And the same with Gancraft. The Gancraft is essentially the exact same thing as an S waiver. Little bit more refined. It costs more, but a little bit more refined, little bit larger size, and then some more detailed colors. So that's a great option as well. If you want to go bigger, you can. You go to the big glides, and that's its own animal. But in the fall, that smaller size is where I like to be. I guess, you know, I should also insert, there are some fisheries that really don't have bait fish. You're restricted to bluegill or panfish. There are really only 2 baits that I throw in the fall when that happens. One is that, again, bull shad, but not the shad, the bull gill. I throw that bull gill, started throwing that last year. That bait flat gets eaten. It's a phenomenal pond bait, phenomenal cover bait, phenomenal around grass, because again, you can be very erratic. You can work it hard, you can burn it, stop it, rip it, pop it. It's very good at triggering bites. And then the other bait, again in the fall, very, very simple. The other bait is Little Creeper, the same guy that makes trash fish. He makes a little panfish bait. And that one's a killer. I caught a bunch of fish on this just the other day. It's just a good size. My biggest issue with bluegill style baits as a whole is that they're a difficult shape. You know, in the real world, a bluegill is a difficult shape for a bass to eat. A crappie is a difficult bait for a bass, or a difficult shape for a bass to eat. You find bass all the time choking on them. So when you're trying to imitate them, it's a difficult shape, and your hookup ratio can be really poor. The bull gill, has no fins on it, so it tends to slide in their mouth pretty well. I get good hookup ratio there. And then with the Little Creeper, it's an incredibly soft bait. It just crunches. I have a great hookup ratio there. That's why those are the 2 baits that I throw, and I really don't branch out very far this time of year. Now, go into your bigger baits. Those 2 tail styles. They're for very different things in my mind. Your paddle style tail, that's more of a hard thumping, with the exception of the trash fish. Trash fish is a little bit soft, but for the most part, it's a hard thumping, aggressive. It's more like a hard bait than like the rest of the soft baits. Very aggressive. You can actually work them. You can rip them if you need to, almost like a fluke. If you miss a fish, you can rip them to try and get a reaction bite afterwards. So that paddle style tail lets you do more, and it gives off a good wide kick, a lot of flash, a lot of movement, and will absolutely draw fish. It'll pull fish from great distance. As far as which ones you should throw, I started throwing the Smash Tech last year. The other one that I throw a lot of that we've talked a lot about is the Osprey. The Tournament Talon is the one I prefer. It's a top hook. I like that Osprey because it's got a lot of weight, so it'll get down deep, and it's got a jig hook, which I really like. I prefer jig hooks if I can. So that Osprey Tournament Talon, either a 6-inch or a 7-inch, phenomenal bait across the country to mimic every kind of bait fish. Especially in that 6-inch size. It looks it's not a very natural bait. It doesn't look perfect by any means. And it's not a painted bait, it's a poured bait. So it doesn't have a finished paint scheme on it. It's a poured bait like this. But it looks a little bit like everything. It's not perfect, but it's close enough that no matter where I go in the country, they'll eat it. The Smash Tech, on the other hand, is more of a high in the water column, just below the surface. Wide thumping, you put a belly treble on it. Now you could rig it with a jig hook or you could back rig it if you wanted to, but the way that I fish it is just below the surface. So if I've got fish that are targeting bigger bait fish, if they're eating big shiners, if they are eating trout or kokanee, if they've got them shallow, then I'll throw that Smash Tech high in the water column, typically in a bold color like white or chartreuse or chartreuse shad, something that will draw fish from great distance. It's got that nice wide kick to get those fish to go. If I'm going to fish lower in the water column, and lower in the water column can be 5 feet deep, it can be 60 feet deep. You can do anything with a swim bait. They're like a do-all bait. Then I go to the osprey. The other bait is going to be the trash fish. And Tim kind of dropped a bomb on you guys a couple weeks back about the trash fish. And I'm sure we will do a dedicated trash fish video because a lot of people begged for it. And it should be done. It needs to be done. And Tim is very good at fishing them, so I'm sure he's the one that's going to do it. But that's another bait that you need to be throwing in the fall, whether that's the original trash fish or the big 8-inch. You can rig them all kinds of ways, right? You can put this on an owner beast. It can be weedless. The way that I like them, I just said I prefer jig hook baits if I can get away with it. That's the big one. That's the 8-inch rigged with a Bastrix, or excuse me, it was originally made for the Bastrix. It's Blade Runner makes it. They make an insert head originally designed for the Bastrix, and they make it in a 6/0. And in the 6/0, that big hook, that guy there, you can take that insert and just pop it right into that 8-inch bait and have a perfect jig hook version of the bait. So you can rig it weedless, or you can rig it with that big jig hook. Personally, I go jig hook unless I'm around cover. I just like the way they hook up. You got a great hookup ratio, put a lot of big fish in the boat that way. But that is a phenomenal, phenomenal bait. Depending on how you rig it, you can fish the whole water column. The reason why this is kind of a separate category, the trash fish as a whole is a separate category, they're soft. And they are so floppy. Like if you take a, I don't know, what's a Hud look like? If you take a Hud, it's pretty floppy, but these guys are like all over the place. Right, they almost fold in half. We hold the head of the bait. That sucker almost folds in half. That tells you what you need to know about the action. A bait that's pretty rigid, you're gonna get the bulk of your action just in the back end of the bait. A bait that's got a lot of flop to it, and it would have even more flop if it didn't have that big jig hook in it. There's an unrigged one. And they're so floppy. What that tells me is that if it's a stiff plastic and it's still that floppy, that means it will have a very hard kick and the whole bait will move. In the case of this bait, it's extremely floppy and it's made of a very, very soft material. So what that tells me is it's just gonna kind of be, for lack of a better word, like a blob. Very muted action, very minimal. It's just gonna kind of like lazily kick along. I'm gonna fish that bait slow. This is gonna be a bottom bait to me, just creeping it on bottom. And we really haven't gotten to retrieves yet with these baits for the most part, and we will talk about that here in a second. But these guys, it's a slow bait in my book. You just lazily on the bottom, and it's just got that nice slow. It's like the crossover between a true boot tail style bait and a Vortex style bait. It's the in-between, and it's deadly coast to coast, north to south. Tim already told you guys, it has smashed tournaments out here for so long. It's just now barely getting back east. We know guys back east that aren't saying a word about it but are making a ton of money, and we're just giving you a heads up that you should be throwing it. On to the Vortex style tail. The two brands in that category that I throw are going to be the Huddleston. That's where we originally saw that style tail. The other one I like is the JSJ. Huddleston has a whole size range in it. JSJ right now has just got that 6-inch, the 6-inch hitch. But the 6-inch hitch is the best bait fish imitator in my opinion. Huddleston started with a trout. He went smaller with the 6-inch or the 68. Went bigger to a 10-inch, but it's a trout profile. That's what it looks like. You can buy a trout profile in a smaller size and paint it like a shad, and it works. But that 6-inch JSJ started with a shad or shiner profile and then put a tail on it, so it's more natural in appearance. The JSJ, pretty slow fishing. I like to just crawl that bait on the bottom. I don't fish it hard, I don't fish it aggressive. The Huddleston I can fish a little bit faster, but both are phenomenal. Now, why throw that style tail? Why do you do that? Well, it's typically the most natural, and two, it works in the coldest water. So where as plastic gets cold, as your water temps drop, as you get into late fall going into winter, as water gets colder, plastic or plastisol or whatever these happen to be made out of, different baits are made out of different materials, it gets stiffer, it gets more rigid, and it actually works less. So a bait that has a big wide kick in September might just have a little bit of tail wobble in November and December. So you need to understand the action of your baits is literally going to change. The Vortex style tail will typically continue to work just the way that it's designed, the way it catches water, the way that it moves. It will continue to work at colder water temperatures than, say, a paddle tail. A paddle tail, in order to get that action in cold water, you've got to be going fast, and that's not what you want in cold water. So that's where that Vortex really takes over. It'll kick in the coldest of water. I mean, down into the 30s. It won't be a big wide kick, but it will still operate even at really slow speed, which is how you're gonna get bit. So again, you've got a whole size range, 6-inch, 8-inch, 10-inch. That's just going to match the size of the food that the fish are eating in your lake. If they're stalking 7-inch trout, you don't throw a 10-inch bait. You throw a 8-inch bait. If they're stalking big trout, well, the 10 is the best widely distributed bait that you can get, so you throw the 10-inch. And then color choice, that's up to you. But with this style, with that Vortex style, again, it's going for that natural. It's not erratic. You're not ripping it. You're not popping it. You're not doing anything. It's steady retrieve. So you're very reliant on the paint job fooling the fish. Over here, that Smash Tech, I'm throwing straight white with red eyes. That has nothing to do with realism. That's a fish is swimming along, it looks up, it sees this big white blob. It's going, what is that? Swims up there to have a look at it. Well, bass don't have hands. The only way that they can figure out what it is to put it in their mouth. So they bite it to see what it is, and you've got them. The Huddleston, opposite end of the spectrum. Natural paint, natural tail, typically fishing very slow. It's just creeping along, doing its thing. And that bass is looking at it going, is it real? Is it not? Is it real? Is it not? Because over here, you can rip it and pop it, make it do things to get that reaction, that aggressive hit. Here you can't do that. If you try and rip it, all it does is speed up and then goes back to being slow. Fish just let it go. You're better off just creeping, relying on that realism, relying on them to come up and say, yep, that looks like a shiner. That looks like what I eat. I'm gonna eat that. So you want to identify essentially how pressured are your fish, how smart are your fish. Can you still fool them? Or do you need to switch over and get them to react to get the bite? That'll be a major factor for you. Reaction versus fooling, very different. If you're back east, very few guys are throwing big baits not enough to truly pressure your fish. There are very few lakes back there where they're pressured that bad. Don't even worry about it. If you're in the West where these baits have been flying for 10, 20 plus years, our fish are getting pretty darn wise. Sometimes this is not your best option anymore because you can't get them to react to it. They'll follow it all day long, but they know the difference and they're never gonna actually take the bite. They'll just look at it. But you go to that reactive style bait and you get that aggressive bite playing on their curiosity. So retrieves. Let's talk about retrieves really quick. Talk a little bit about gear. Mostly with gear, I'm just gonna put it in the description so you guys can go check out all the gear. I won't harp on it here. But retrieves, for the most part, the way you're going to fish these baits is that slow, steady. Chuck it out, let it go to the bottom, and just crawl. The colder the water gets, the slower that you crawl. And I can't tell you how many clients I've had on the boat, because we've done swimbait retrieve videos before. In fact, you know what? I'm gonna put that in the video description too, show you how to retrieve these baits. We've actually done several of them over the years, but I'll still give you the brief version of it. The colder the water gets, the slower you're going to go. Even with all those videos out there telling people how to go slow, it never fails when I have a client actually physically get on my boat and we go out to throw a Huddleston. We make the first cast and I say, half that speed. Now half that speed. Now half that speed. Now you're getting close. Every time they're like, man, I watched the video. I heard you say slow and I still had no clue that you meant that slow. We are talking slow. When that water's freezing, I mean, this bait is barely moving. Barely moving. That tail's hardly doing anything. You're relying on realism. When it bumps a rock, you might get a little bit of wiggle out of it. Otherwise, it's just barely moving. But it works. They eat it. As the water is warmer, as we're getting into fall, think spinnerbait. Don't complicate this swimbait fishing. Don't do it. You can kill yourself trying to figure out how to make them eat this thing. Wait until they're aggressive. Chuck and wind. Chuck and wind. I'm not saying it's always the best retrieve, but I'm saying if you just want some confidence and you want to get a bite, cover water. Just throw it out, let it fall for a second, and reel it back. If you get a follower, that's great information. Now you know where he lives. You can come back later, try a different retrieve, try a different color, different style, fool that fish into biting. But for now, you're just trying to raise them up, see where they live. Throw it out, reel it back. Don't overthink it. Think of it as a spinnerbait, a crankbait, a chatterbait. Just throw it. They will eat it. And when they hit it at that speed, they thump it, man. They eat that bait. When we're doing that ultra slow crawl, you're probably getting bites and don't even know it. Because the bites, they don't smash it. Once in a while they might try and break your arm. But more often than not, they just dunk. Feels like a light jig bite or a worm bite. Just dunk. That's all you get. And you crack them. You don't wait for more. The internet is full of people who have opinions. That will never change. Everyone has an opinion on how to set the hook on a swim bait. I am a firm believer that when you feel them touch it, you hit them. You might miss some little ones, but if you get a giant to bite, the second she sucks that thing in, the second it comes in, she knows that it's not what she thought it was, and she is trying to get it back out. People will tell you to let them load up, be slow, wait for it, and it might work sometimes. I am not that guy. I am telling you, you crack them. When they touch it, you smash. You give them everything you got. Again, you might miss some bites. But the giant, that one fish that you're looking for, no matter where you are in the country, because the size of a giant is relative to where you are in the country. But that giant, whether that giant is 4 pounds or 18 pounds, that giant is the smartest fish in that system. It's the one fish that is going to try and get that swim bait back out of its mouth as quickly as possible. It's the one fish that you do not want to miss. Hit them fast, hit them now, hit them hard. Back to retrieves. So the colder the water, you're creeping. The warmer the water, you're going faster. The glide baits are a whole different animal. There's a lot of ways to twitch them, rip them, pop them. Same with those hard baits. We have a dedicated video specifically to how to fish an S-Waver, and it applies to every glide bait. I don't care if you're throwing a Hinkle shad, I don't care if you're throwing a Depths 250, it doesn't matter. That information works for all of them. I will give you a link to that in the video description. But typically with the hard baits, we're fishing that more aggressive. Fish it fast, stop it. Or fish it, rip, double rip. Different retrieves to try and trigger aggressive bites. Other than that, it's simple, especially paddletails. Paddletails, for the most part, we're just rolling them. Every once in a while, we might pop them. You've seen that in the videos in the past. For the most part, you just steady retrieve like it's a little spinnerbait. Don't even worry about it. Let the fish come to you. Swimbait fishing is not complicated. We throw them on big gear, the biggest gear we can get away with. Now granted, a little 2.8, we're gonna throw that for the most part on a spinning rod. The big baits, we're gonna throw on giant rods. Tim and I throw 100% of our swim baits on braid to leader. Again, internet's full of opinions. We've been doing this for a very long time. Caught a lot of big fish. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of swimbait fish. Everyone is entitled to their opinion. But after thousands and thousands and thousands of fish and a lot of giant fish, braid to leader is an awesome system. It has its pluses, it has its minuses, but if you're out there reading on the internet and you're reading the stuff that says they're casting baits off, they don't understand how to swim bait with braid. They're using way too light a line. That's all that is. The number one issue that people have is just misconception. They are literally using the wrong gear. Issues like a leader not banging through, that's a legitimate thing. You either have to learn to adapt to that, tie a different knot, there are ways you can adapt. But in terms of getting bit and putting fish in the boat, I have never found a better system than braid to leader. I've tried everything. That's how I do it. I can tell you confidently, I recommend you do that as well. But whatever you're comfortable with, however you end up, you can still put fish in the boat. I hope this information helps you guys. We'll give you links to the reels, the rods, the line, the baits, the hooks, everything. It is going to take me as long to do the video description for this video as it did to go through all of my boxes and figure out which baits I wanted to talk to you guys about. But that's what this is about. It's about helping you guys become better anglers, about helping you build confidence so that across this country you can go out. I don't care if you're fishing for largemouth, smallmouth, spotted bass, Alabama bass. You can go out there, catch more fish, catch bigger fish. You can swim bait. This is not hard. It's a head game. The actual reality of doing it, very simple. You can do this. You can be successful. You can catch big bass. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends. We appreciate you guys. We'll talk to you soon.